All right, so again, welcome everybody to the first Reading Scotland session of the semester. We are pleased to be able to welcome John D. Burns to give us our first presentation of the semester. He is originally from Birkenhead, which is along the River Mersey, across from Liverpool. But his passion for spending time outdoors was inspired by a school trip to the Lake District. Since then, he has moved to Scotland, which, amongst other things, he has then easier access to mountaineering there. But John has also traveled beyond the UK to mountains in both North America and in Kenya. John is not only an author, but also a performer. Amongst other performances, he has also had stints at the Fringe Festival in Edinburgh. And his first book, The Last Hillwalker, was shortlisted for the Great Outdoors magazine's Book of the Year. That and other books of his, including Bothy Tales and The Hot Tent Diaries, illustrate various mountain explorations in Scotland, as well as beyond its borders and across oceans. The books are comprised of anecdotes and vignettes, which are primarily nonfiction in nature. John has not only published nonfiction, but also the novel Skydance, which takes the reader into the remote Scottish hills and addresses hunting practices, damaged landscape, rewilding, and perhaps most poignantly, a passion for wild places. John continues to travel, write, and perform, and invites others to explore the magic of wild Scotland. So without much further ado, thank you again, John, for joining us, and the floor is yours.
Thank you. I'm very honoured to be here, and I think I would point out that I'm not an academic, so I think actually some of you will probably know a lot more about some of the topics I'm about to talk about than actually I do. As I say, I don't know what people know, so some of the things I may be talking about you perhaps already know about. I'm just going to have to explain to you in my own words where I'm coming from. I think primarily what I want to talk about today is my relationship with wild places, and I think the relationships with that other communities within the Highlands have with our wilderness and how that's changing. I want really to take you on a journey. It's a journey that starts, as Kelly's already said, with my beginnings in Merseyside and how I discovered wild places and the hills of Britain. And I wanted to show how that has changed over time. I'm also going to tell you a little bit more about myself, but I think Kelly's actually covered that as far as you can do, really. And I also want to talk about how I became engaged with the landscape and how my view of the mountains and patterns of land ownership has changed my views about the Scottish Hills. And I also want to talk about those wild places, and I think as Kelly was talking about, Bothies in particular, the culture around Bothies and what that sort of says about our relationship with the landscape. And I want to talk a little bit about some of the debates that are taking place in modern Scotland right now, and how I think some of the literature, some of the writing has affected those, or perhaps taken part in that debate, and how I've tried to influence it from my own writing. So I hope that sort of covers what you're interested in. I'm almost 70 now. I have to announce, much to my own amazement. I've lived the greater part of my life in the Highlands of Scotland. Just to give you a little background for me, I worked initially as a social worker until my mid-40s, and my great passion for the outdoors led me, as Kelly said, to climb in various parts of the world. But my greatest passion in life was climbing ice-clad hills with axes and crampons, and doing some of the sort of more severe and difficult ice climbs, and places like the north face of Ben Nevis. But in my late 40s, life changed for me, I guess, and I found myself as a single parent, um, looking after one of I have two daughters. My youngest daughter is severely autistic, and I think I had always had an interest in writing, in expressing myself through language, but life had sort of got in the way, and I'd not done a great deal of that. But I don't anybody who has worked with someone or lives with someone or knows someone who is autistic will be well aware just how important the meaning of words can be. And I think through working with her, I became more and more interested in language. And I have to say, it was a very isolating experience at time caring for her. And I began to want to have this desire to write. And I started out writing, in fact, a small collection of poetry, which was about autism and my perceptions of autism. And I probably would have told you at the time, I would have told you that that book was to raise awareness about autism. I think looking back on it now, I can see that actually I used writing to work through my own feelings and to sort of express how I felt about her position, her situation, and the problems that she faced. But nevertheless, this I suppose this kind of triggered my own interest in writing, and the passion that perhaps was sort of laying dormant within me, really. And I've now written the books that Kelly spoke of, and on top of that, I've also written and performed two one-man plays, both loosely associated with the hills, I suppose. One was about the occultist Aleister Crowley, who actually lived for some time not that far from Inverness, where I live now. I was also a leading mountaineer, and also I wrote and performed a one-man play about George Mallory, the British climber who died in 1924 on his attempt on Everest. So, and recently, hard to believe again, I've rekindled my career as a stand-up comedian. I think that's probably enough about me, but I wanted to say a bit about how my interest in writing started off. To start this journey, I spoke earlier of a journey. So let me to start this journey, but let's take a rail journey. If you it sort of starts living in Inverness. We virtually everybody here commutes or finds themselves going down to the Central Belt, which is obviously where the majority of the population is, to the to the Scottish capital, perhaps of Edinburgh. And this is a typical journey. You can either take the train from Inverness to Edinburgh, which can take somewhere between 3 and 5 hours, depending on the weather and the state of industrial relations, and or you can drive. And if you're on that train, you start in Edinburgh, which strangely enough probably has some of the highest population density in Britain, I would imagine, because the search for space has been quite limited, really, in Edinburgh. And if you climb on board that train, it takes you out of the Scottish capital, and you go over the Forth rail bridge, and you begin to head north. And as you begin to head north, the landscape begins to change around you. And I have spent many journeys staring out of the window as we go north. You come to the city of Perth, which is really the end of the sort of urban area of Scotland, and you begin to head further north beyond that. And first of all, you'll pass through fairly rich farmland with small villages dotted with habitation. But as you go further north, the landscape again changes, and you begin to climb over the high passes into what are essentially the foothills of the Cairngorm Mountains. And one of the things that stands out in my mind was making that journey one day. And there was an American tourist, young woman sitting opposite me, staring out at the landscape. And I remember that she turned to me and said, isn't it magnificent? Now, I realized that it depends whose eyes are looking at that landscape. She saw through that train window a magnificent wilderness of rolling hills with stags and hinds, deer wandering through the beautiful streams, and to what appeared a magical place. But that's not what I saw. What I saw was a scarred and damaged landscape where the hand of man has wrought immense destruction. I saw a landscape devoid of its trees and wildlife, populated by herds of red deer who are stunted, dwarfed, and whose only purpose is to provide sport for rich landowners. So, and I realized that, you know, my perception of that landscape has changed over time. I'm sure when I started out, I probably would have seen the same landscape that she saw. And one of the things I noticed, I feel, is that once you see that damage, once you see that scarring, you can't unsee that. You can't stop seeing that. So my views have changed. I go back to what Kelly was saying, and I lived on Merseyside. Where my father worked in the shipyard, and his father worked building ships before that. And Birkenhead was really a very industrial area, although the shipyards, I think, even in the 70s, even in the 70s before I left there, were obviously going into decline anyway. But when I was a boy, walking anywhere on Merseyside, which was very densely populated, if you tried to go anywhere, you found yourself immediately shepherded onto tracks and paths with signs everywhere saying, you know, no trespassers, and don't leave the track, and you can't come in here, basically. And that had been my experience. I'd hardly seen a blade of grass or a field, really, or even any kind of wild place. And the tallest things I saw were the cranes of the shipyard that surrounded us and sort of loomed over the town. And I remember vividly that the school that I was going to, which was a school, I'd not passed our 11 plus. I don't know if you know what that is, but that was a test when you were about 11. And the idea of that test was to decide who would be academic, or who at least was worth educating, and who probably wasn't worth educating and would be better off as an apprentice. So I unfortunately failed that and was relegated to what was called a secondary modern school, which was designed to produce people who would work in shipyards, essentially. But surprisingly enough, and looking back on it, I'm quite surprised they did. Some of the teachers decided that they would offer some of us boys a little vacation to the Lake District, and so I can remember we climbed aboard a bus. This must have been the early 70s, and it was one of the old chrome buses that they had in those days. That it was obligatory, I think, to smoke and they reeked of cigarette smoke, and they were made inside of very hard chrome bars everywhere. I think the purpose of that was to make sure that if there was an accident, everybody got injured. And about a dozen of us climbed on board that. And my father, who had never really been to any mountains at all, had a sort of, I suppose, an Everest view of what I was like to be facing, and had equipped me with very thick mountaineering breeches and a great big pair of boots. So I felt like Edmund Hillary when I got on the bus, and we headed north up the M6 into the lakes, which is about a journey of about 2 hours really. But I'd never really left Merseyside, so it felt to me like traveling to a different world. And it's strange how things affect you, but I remember getting off that bus and stepping out into what appeared to me to be the biggest tract of wild land I'd ever seen. There was great rolling hills and rivers, and there was sheep and stiles and paths, and an openness that I'd never experienced before. I can remember vividly the smell of the place, the scent of the sheep and the wind and the grass, and that remained with me. I had all this heavy walking gear, and it was of course July, and some of the hottest weather we'd had for years. And so unfortunately for me, I spent the whole holiday dripping sweat and soaked in my own perspiration. And I also experienced we had in those days the youth hostel association, and the aim of the youth hostel was to provide young people with relatively cheap access to wild places. I also think that one of the philosophies of the Youth Hostel Association was that it was very good for young people in their development to suffer, and so we suffered on uncomfortable beds in large dormitories where you had to be in bed by 10 o'clock, I think, and we were all made to do menial work in the kitchen and places like that. It's also worth remembering that in those days in the youth hostels, you weren't allowed to travel by any motorized transport. You had to walk or cycle or canoe to get there. So that was frowned upon. So the youth hostel was also made a great impression on me, and that they were ruled over by youth hostel wardens who were, I have to say, quite a unique brand of men and women whose gift in life, their great purpose in life, seemed to be, to me at least, to enforce rules upon a terrified group of young people who had absolutely no idea where they were and had been catapulted into an unusual a landscape that was unknown to them. But nevertheless, despite the horrors of the Youth Hostel Association, that holiday made an incredible impact on me. And the next summer vacation my friend and I took, we walked the Pennine Way. Now, the Pennine Way is well, it's 270 miles. I'm not sure what that is in kilometers. Probably about, anyway, you can work it out better than me. And at the time, it felt like to me as though I was walking again through a wild landscape. It essentially follows the spinal column of Britain in a way, the hills of the Pennines, and it felt like a wild place at that time. And that was when I was about 19 or 18. But I returned 40 years later and discovered that when they say age is only a number, whoever's done that has never returned to try to walk up the spine of Britain that you were able to do as a teenager. However, but what is significant about it is, again, I saw that with different eyes, because my eyes have been attuned to Scotland by then, and it seemed to me that actually we'd been walking over a very narrow ribbon of moorland that led all the way between the industrial cities of northern England, places like Leeds, Manchester, and actually was very much a man-made landscape. So I moved to Scotland, as I say, some 30, 40 years ago now, and I began to, at first it appeared to me a very wild, open place. One of the things that really amazed me about coming to Scotland was you could go somewhere and walk through a landscape that actually didn't have any paths. Not so few people had walked there, they hadn't made a path. Everywhere I'd ever been in my life, there had been paths to follow. But in Scotland, there were places where there were no paths, and you could walk for several days without seeing a soul, without seeing a single person, and that made an incredible impression upon me. And I thought at first that this was a very wild place. But as I grew more accustomed to it, I can remember walking in glens, and glens, what we call valleys, I'm sure you know that. And we would find ruined buildings scattered here and there. Virtually every empty wild glen I went to, these houses, these places were just a few walls, perhaps a gable end here and there, and I began to learn that the glens of Scotland had actually at one time been far more populated than they were, and obviously the movement I'm sure you know about, the clearances, which started in about roughly 1750 and went on for about 100 years, where the population of the Highland Hills was cleared away, in part because sheep farming was introduced. And so the populations of many of the wild places that I explored actually had at one time been thriving communities. I'll give you an example. A place I used to go to, Morven, which is a peninsula of land just to the north of Fort William, and that has an area, I think, of something like 650 kilometers or thereabouts. And today it has a population of about 320. Prior to the clearances, it had a population of some 2,500. So you can see that the Scotland that we're in today is very different. The forests that have been cleared away, obviously were largely gone by that time, but there were remnants of the Caledonian forest left, I think. So we had, by 1860, say, a landscape that had been cleared of its people, and it was empty and devoid. And then, God bless her, Queen Victoria and her husband Prince Albert arrived on scene, and unfortunately for us, Queen Victoria had a passion for the Highlands, or a passion for a kind of Highland image that really didn't exist. And Albert loved to hunt, and so they came to the Highlands and inhabited the great estates, places like Balmoral, which have, I suppose the best way of describing it is a castle in the center of it, and around it rolling hills, and an area which had cleared of their trees, which were populated by deer that could be used for, that could be what they call stalked, hunted, and around that mythical kind of Highland image grew the sort of the the culture of the piper and the and kilts that I don't think that had some relationship to what had gone before, but actually were a kind of fiction in a way. Now, at that time, when wealthy industrialists were started to look for a model of what they should be doing with all their money, they saw what Queen Victoria and Albert were doing and followed suit. And that's had a profound effect upon the Highlands, because it has meant that certainly the Highlands is divided up into large sporting estates, and the proportion of land that is owned by a very small population of people is very high. I think something like just over 400 folk own about 50% of the Highland landscape, and having a most Highland estates, or the traditional Highland estate, will have a large house and gamekeepers around it. And when Victoria was developing this sort of culture, the gamekeepers there, part of their role was to essentially clear the land of its native wildlife, so that it would be reserved for the populations of deer that these wealthy people wish to hunt. It was really a demonstration, I think, of ostentatious wealth. Nobody owns a Highland estate to make money out of it, really. It's more that you want to demonstrate that you own it, and that you are a person of substance. It interests me quite a lot. One of the things that occurred to me is, if you go into, I'm sure some of you have already visited these places, if you go into any stately home or any estate house, they're usually large, mostly castellated in a sort of a mock version of what a castle might be. But if you look at the displays of many of these places, there's usually a vast quantity of the heads of deer that have been unfortunately enough to look up at the wrong point and have been shot. But also, it's a kind of, what you always think is a kind of macabre celebration of death. But also, you'll see on the walls, it's a vast collection of old antique weapons, swords and axes and claymores and hooked things that no one knows what they really are. And these are regarded as curios by tourists, and they're interesting things to look at. But I always think that actually what you're looking at is when these implements of war were actually made, they weren't for displays, they weren't curios. They were actually an expression of coercion. I think they demonstrated that that's where power was, and these implements were there to enforce that. So the landscape was very open, and we still have today the Highlands dominated by shooting estates, and indeed, obviously, the people who owned the land were powerful by definition, and made laws that ensured that a lot of the estates stayed together. For example, I think if you're pursuing a landowner, I think this is right, for a debt, you can't force him to sell land. So we have a Highlands now where the history of the landscape has had a profound effect upon the relationship that people have with that land. in that the concentration of ownership has meant that although in Scotland, one of the things that we have in Scotland as a sort of mountaineering, sort of hill walking community, is that we do have a right to roam. We have in legislation we can wander pretty much where we like, and you also have a right to camp if you wish. You have to be sort of realistic. You don't camp on someone's garden, you know, but we can wander about and go where we wish. That's in stark contrast to the legislation in England, where the trespass is very much an issue. Obviously, the population pressures in England are far greater than they are in Scotland, and I should say, you're obviously aware anyway, that the population in density in Scotland, the Highlands, is something like 8 people to a square kilometre, and in the Highlands, most of that population is centred around the Moray Firth. So this kind of land ownership pattern has had a profound effect upon the Scotland we see today. Today, the trends that are occurring in the Highlands, in a lot of communities, depopulation is still continuing. A lot of that is obviously through economic necessity. There are a few jobs in rural areas, and people are leaving those areas to move in. Inverness is growing exponentially, so people, I think, are moving from the more remote areas into Inverness into the cities. It's also a case that because the populations are so low, they tend to be an aging population, so that the younger folk within some of the more remote areas will sort of leach out. I call it a kind of a bit like a cultural anemia. If your young people are leaving areas and only a relatively small population of older folk remain, then it becomes increasingly difficult to support those communities, in terms of educational facilities, in terms of healthcare, that kind of thing. And so a lot of communities are increasingly fragile in sort of more remoter areas, largely due, I think, to the pattern of land ownership. So we have a decimated land, we have a decimated wildlife. Wildlife certainly just clings to the edges. There are obviously debates, the kind of debates that happen all over the world, I guess, over in a sense, industrial exploitation of the landscape, and the arguments that are more in terms of in environmental issues, in terms of how we conserve that landscape. It's interesting that we have within the Cairngorms, there is a national park, and when the national parks were set up, they were set up with the idea of preserving what was there, the landscape that was there. But that sort of implies that the state of the landscape as it was when the national parks were brought into being was actually the state of the landscape as it should be. And in fact, within the Cairngorm National Park, even, there are enormous conflicts about land use, and there are arguments and debates over the skiing development that is there, which has been a financial disaster. But it's strange. So is a national park there to preserve the landscape, to rewild it? Those debates are taking place. Over recent years, well, I suppose about 10 years ago, say, it felt as though the great monolithic sort of establishments of the big estates was something that was not going to change. It was immutable. It wasn't. It was so settled, sort of set, almost literally set in stone. And it didn't seem that that could change. I think in recent years that there is a change now in the Highlands. It's certainly the case that new landowners, people coming into Scotland to buy places, are less and less interested in the traditional model of the country estate, if you like. They are bringing newer and different practices. For example, Anders Poulsen has rewilded, or has allowed the trees to grow back in places like Glenfeshie, and they are changing. And I think there's things like carbon sequestration have meant that there are other models that you can use. Some of the more damaging aspects of the sort of hunting culture that exists in the Highlands are beginning to be reined back. That things like driven grouse shooting, which has a very serious effect on about between 10 and 15% of the Highlands. Basically, if you have a grouse moor, which is when the grouse, little birds, if you don't know, are driven towards men with guns, normally men, but in order to make that sustainable, then the rest of the wildlife has to be kept down. You have to kill raptors, you have to get rid of foxes, things like that, badgers, and it has a massive effect on the landscape. Very recently, legislation was introduced to the effect that these driven grouse moors, as they're called, have to be registered. And that registration, I think, is the beginning of control. And I think there's a recognition amongst the folk, even in that industry, even in the shooting industry, that actually the model that we have now isn't really sustainable. So things are beginning to change, but there is still a debate in the Highlands about what is sustainable, whether we should move to a different model. I'm going to talk a little bit about, okay, I'll talk, right, I think I'm running out of time a little bit. So I was asked to talk about, one of the questions that was raised was about, I've written about bothies. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about bothies, which is perhaps a unique thing to Scotland. I don't know. And it certainly, I think, has a fairly profound impact on the hill culture, the relationship of the people to the landscape, which is, I think, quite interesting. Bothies are essentially old cottages, usually shepherds' cottages, which are no longer used, and they're in remote places. And there's no there's no running water, there's no electricity, there's no sanitation, there's no heating, there's no lighting. So when you go into these old cottages, it's a bit like having a holiday in the 15th century. There's nothing there really. But they are nevertheless very significant things for the folk who like to travel the Highland Hills. The reason, and I went recently, well, a few months ago now, to a celebration of the renovation over the last 70 years of the remote bothies in the Cairngorm area. Just to give you some idea of how this happened, the huts and the bothies were always important places that walkers and climbers used to shelter in. But 70 years ago, they had been neglected for decades. Most of them were falling down. Some of them were already almost past repair. And what happened at that time was, I guess it was a sort of a grassroots movement, really, that the people who loved these wild places, who visited them, I guess initially probably started to repair them just so they were a bit more comfortable. You know, they would patch up a hole in the roof, or they would fix a window or try and prop a wall up. And very gradually, over the last 7 decades, our movement grew. Not an organized movement at first. It was just a few people who got together and talked around the fire in these bothies. And but what's interesting, I think, is that many of the Bothy community, feel passionately about the Bothies. They've carried wood in long ways. They've carried concrete and all kinds of heavy stuff over many miles to repair these places. Now it's moved on to a more formal thing. But now most of the Cairngorm Bothies, in fact, all of them, have been properly restored so that they will continue for the next generation. And what I think is important about that was not a movement that was started by landowners. That was not a movement that was started by national bodies. It was started by a few groups of folk who just thought this was too important a resource to lose. And there's a whole culture around bothies where people spend. When I came back to mountaineering after quite a while, and what I like about bothies is there is a unique feeling there late in the evening where you know that you're in an old place that has probably housed families where children were raised. It's a kind of contact with the history. And I spend quite a lot of time in bothies and other forms of camping and things like that. And I often do that on my own. And apart from just being completely antisocial, I often wonder, it took me a while to figure out why I like doing that. But I think that there is a difference between, there's a big difference between solitude, which I think is something you choose, and between being lonely, which is something which is imposed on you. I feel solitude is important. And my reasoning for that, I think, is that if you go with somebody else, another person, or another 2 or 3 folk, you bring the outside world with all its politics and its conflicts into that place. But if you're on your own, there is a much greater capacity, I think, for absorbing the atmosphere around you. And what I like to call you begin to sense and to listen to the sort of heartbeat of the landscape in a place like that. So bothies have been very important. And I think that also they are of significance for particular reasons. People feel a connection with the landscape in a bothy that they are denied in other places. For example, I think it's in Scandinavia, they have the tradition of huts. You can build yourself a hut. Or in Canada or places like that, it's probably relatively easy, as far as I'm aware, to build a log cabin somewhere. You can have a place which is yours in wild landscape. In Scotland and in Britain in general, that's very, very different, very difficult to do that. So the only places that you can experience that kind of connection with the wild places and with nature is in bothies, which is why I felt they're important. There are also places where the traditions of storytelling that were very important in the Highlands, people just gathering around and exchanging tales, that has largely died out. We have the internet, we have TV, we have all kinds of other things taking place. But in bothies, people will sit around a fire and they will talk and they will tell stories, mostly lies, but that doesn't matter. It's a connection that I think bothies have. So but I just wanted to say that's why I think they are particularly important for us. So there is a debate taking place there about just what kind of Scotland we're going to inherit. What are we going to do with this place? There's a fantastic opportunity, I think, to rewild Scotland and to use our natural resources in a way that could help the economy. Places like the Isle of Mull has brought back a tremendous sort of economic benefit from the folk visiting to see the sea eagles. There is a model of a future. There could be a future in Scotland because we have such vast, wild, open spaces that we could create a kind of green tourism. We could rewild with creatures like lynx and hopefully one day maybe wolves, and we could have these wild places as resources, as assets, that where our tourism which is our lifeblood now, really could flourish. I'm going to say a little bit, I'm nearly there, I think. I'm going to say a little bit about why my book Skydance was mentioned earlier, and so there is this debate taking place as to what kind of Scotland we want. And I'm not sure that debate in terms of literature has really taken the imagination of the wider Scottish public. My reason for saying that really is that there are very important books like Andy Whiteman's The Poor Had No Lawyers. There are books on rewilding and about what we could do, but these tend to be, I'm conscious I'm saying this in front of academics, these tend to be fairly dry academic treatises. And when I wanted when I wrote Skydance, which is a very unusual novel, it's a comic novel, you don't get many of those these days. What I tried to do in Skydance was to look at some of the themes about what's happening to our landscape, about where we are, about why this has occurred and where we might go, and to put that in a context and write about it in a way that would engage with the wider population who were not people who wish to read or academic treatises. So my great dream is to engage the public through TV. So I'm hoping that Skydance will one day be turned into a drama and influence folk about, bring people into this debate. Scotland has a chance to be something different. You know, we have the opportunity to create a place where nature has a home and where communities can be viable. And my writing is in part a way of trying to influence and trying to create that vision. So that, I think that's a very potted version. I'm conscious that I've covered a lot of themes and maybe not gone into much detail with any of them, but that's been where my writings come from. And I think one of the things in my writing, I suppose one of the things that my readers tell me is that I'm able somehow to bring them with me. What I always wanted to do was to take the reader somewhere and let them feel the wind against their face, you know, let them smell the wood smoke. And I think in some way, I hope that can give people an understanding and a realization of just how valuable these places are. You cannot expect anyone to try to work for the to restore nature to its proper place unless they value that nature. And I hope that through my writing, I've been able to encourage people to enable people to experience these things and perhaps in some small way to produce some sort of change. Okay, thank you very much. And if you'd like to open it up to questions, Kelly?